The prison chow hall was loud, with metal trays clanging and voices bouncing off the cold concrete walls. The smell of beans, stale bread, and disinfectant thick in the air. A new inmate sat quietly at the far end of a long table, his head lowered, eyes focused on the plate in front of him. It wasn't much mashed potatoes, a scoop of beans, and a slice of cornbread, but in a place like this, it was all a man could look forward to. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't make eye contact, and didn't want trouble. Across the room, Big Hank was watching. Hank was a giant 6'4", built like a wall, his pale skin covered in tattoos that wrapped around his thick neck and down to his wrists. He had been inside for more than a decade, and in that time he had become the unchallenged bully of Cell Block. See, everyone knew his rules. And the first rule was simple. Nothing in this block was truly yours unless Hank said it was. Hank's heavy boots thudded across the floor as he walked toward the new man. His crew trailed behind him, grinning like they were about to watch a show. Conversations at nearby tables grew quieter, not because people cared, but because they knew when Hank moved, something ugly was about to happen. Hank stopped at the table and stared down at the man. "New meat," he said in a low, slow voice. "You think you can just sit anywhere you want?" The man didn't look up, his voice calm but firm. "Just trying to eat." Hank gave a crook smile and leaned slightly closer. "Eat? Not today." Without another word, Hank grabbed the jug of cold water sitting on the edge of the table and tipped it forward. The water splashed down over the man's head, soaking his hair, his shirt, and his tray. The mashed potatoes collapsed into a soupy mess. The cornbread dissolved into soggy crumbs, and the beans floated in the cold puddle. Laughter erupted around them. Some inmates pounded their tables while others whistled like they were cheering a performance. Hank set the empty jug down with a loud clank and leaned closer, his breath hot. "Welcome to Cell Block C, rookie. Your food is mine, your seat is mine, and if I ever don't like your face..." He paused and smirked. "You won't like." "What happens next?" Water dripped from the man's chin as he slowly pushed the ruined tray aside. His hands were still, his face calm, but his eyes dark and steady, locked with Hank's for the briefest moment. In that look was no fear, no panic, only something quiet and unreadable. "Are you finished?" he asked softly. Hank laughed loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Oh, he's got a mouth. Don't worry, we'll fix that." The big man turned away, his crew following him out of the chow hall, still laughing. The room's noise returned, but now it carried the low hum of whispers. "That's Big Hank. Stay out of his way. The new guy's done for. Won't last a week." The man sat alone, his clothes clinging cold and heavy to his skin, his stomach empty. He ignored the whispers, closing his eyes for a moment as if reaching far back into memory. Somewhere years ago, there was a small dusty room that smelled faintly of incense. A stern old voice. The sound of hands clapping sharply in rhythm. Long hours of repetition, balance, and patience. "Don't start the fight," the voice had said. "End it when it comes." He opened his eyes again, his expression unchanged. Big Hank had no idea that the new meat had spent years mastering the art of stillness and the power that came from it. Years training in the discipline and explosiveness of Kung Fu. Before this was over, everyone in Cell Block C would know exactly who they were dealing with. The days that followed were a slow burn, the kind of tension that made the air feel heavier every time the two men were in the same room. The new inmate kept to himself, speaking little, moving only when he had to, always keeping his eyes steady, but never confrontational. He spent hours in the yard walking the edges, pacing like a man mapping out every inch of his surroundings. He didn't join card games, didn't play basketball, didn't sit with a crew. To most of the block, this meant he was either scared or stupid, either way, a target. To Hank, it meant the man was ignoring the unspoken rules, and that couldn't stand. On the third day, it started again. The yard was loud with shouts and bouncing basketballs when Hank wandered over, his crew in tow. The new inmate was leaning against the fence, watching the sky, his hands loosely clasped behind his back. Hank stopped in front of him, casting a long shadow. "Heard you didn't touch your lunch today," Hank said, pretending to sound concerned. "That's no way to live in here, rookie. Gotta keep your strength up." The man's gaze didn't shift from the clouds. "I'll manage." The smirk on Hank's face didn't fade, but his eyes narrowed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sandwich, took a bite, and then let the rest fall to the dirt at the man's feet. "You want it?" he asked, his tone mocking. The man didn't answer. He just glanced down at the sandwich, then back up at Hank without moving his head, as if the act itself wasn't worth responding to. Hank took a small step closer, closing the space until they were nearly chest to chest. "You think you're better than the rest of us? You think you're too good to play along?" The crew behind Hank laughed, sensing a moment. Inmates nearby stopped talking, the quiet spreading outward in ripples. The man finally spoke, his voice still calm. "I think you're trying to make me angry. But I don't get angry for free." Hank tilted his head, almost amused. "Oh yeah? What do I gotta pay?" "You'll find out," the man said simply. There was something in the way he said it that made a few onlookers exchange nervous glances. Hank chuckled, but it was tighter now, the laugh of someone who didn't like being confused. He jabbed a finger into the man's chest and walked away, muttering, "We'll see." That night, in the dim light of his cell, the man stood in the narrow strip of floor between his bed and the wall. He began to move, slow and controlled, each shift of weight precise, each breath deep and steady. His hands cut the air in deliberate arcs, his feet sliding soundlessly on the concrete. The motions were small, invisible to most, but every muscle was engaged. Balance, power, focus. He remembered his master's words. "A fight is won long before the first punch. It's won here." He tapped his temple. Across the tier, Hank was telling his crew that he was going to teach the rookie his place tomorrow. He had no idea that the lesson was already being prepared, and it wouldn't be the one he planned. The next morning started like every other inside, with the blare of the wake-up bell and the shuffle of boots on cold concrete. Inmates moved toward the chow hall in uneven lines, some talking low, others yawning or rubbing their eyes. At the end of the line walked the new man, a slow, steady pace like he had nowhere urgent to be. His name, as the guards had called it, out during roll, was Darnell Cole. Most of the block only knew him as the rookie or new meat, but now the name was making its way through the whispers. In the chow hall, Darnell took a seat at the far corner again, his tray holding the same lifeless food as everyone else's. He ate without hurry, chewing slowly, eyes down but alert. Hank came in late, loud as always, his crew surrounding him. Like shadows, they spotted Darnell immediately. Hank didn't even bother getting his food first. He made a straight line toward the corner, the crowd parting in silence. "Well, well," Hank said, stopping at the table. "If it isn't Mr. Quiet, how's breakfast treating you?" Darnell didn't answer right away. He set his fork down, looked at Hank and said, "Better than yesterday." Hank grinned, then reached down and without warning, flipped Darnell's tray onto the floor. Eggs, bread, and beans splattered across the concrete. "Guess now it's not so good." The laughter from the crew was immediate, but the rest of the room was quiet. Everyone was watching. Darnell stayed seated for a moment, staring at the mess on the floor. He took a slow breath, then stood up, not fast, not aggressive, just deliberate. He was shorter than Hank, leaner too, but there was something in the way he carried himself that made a few inmates instinctively step back. "You've had your fun," Darnell said, voice steady. "Now stop." Hank's smile faltered for just a second before he let out a laugh. "Stop? You think you can tell me what to do?" He leaned in close, towering over Darnell. "You gonna make me?" Darnell didn't move, didn't flinch. If I have to. Hank shoved him hard in the chest, sending him back a step. That was the moment. The room held its breath. Darnell's stance shifted, almost imperceptibly, his feet planting, knees bending slightly, shoulders loose. Hank moved in for another shove, but this time Darnell's hands came up, quick as a flash. He grabbed Hank's wrist, turned with the motion, and in one smooth movement, twisted Hank's arm and sent him stumbling to the side. Hank caught himself, spun, and came back swinging. But Darnell sidestepped, his palm shooting forward in a sharp strike to Hank's chest. The big man staggered back 2 steps, eyes wide like he'd been hit by more than just muscle. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. No one had ever seen Hank get moved like that. Darnell didn't press the attack. He just stood there, calm, breathing slow. "That was a warning," he said quietly. "Next time you won't get one." For a moment, Hank just glared, his jaw tight. Then he turned sharply and walked out, his crew scrambling to follow. The whispers began again, but now they carried something new, something Hank hadn't felt in years. Doubt. That afternoon, the yard was quieter than usual. Word of the morning's clash had spread through every tier, every cell. Men who once only whispered Hank's name now spoke Darnell's in the same breath. Some thought Hank was humiliated. Others believed he was biding his time. Those who knew Hank well said one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let it go. From the far corner of the yard, Darnell could feel Hank's eyes on him. He didn't have to look to know the bully was watching, plotting. Hank sat at a picnic table with his crew, speaking in low tones, glancing over every few minutes. The crew looked tense, which meant Hank was already planning his payback. A short, stocky inmate named Reggie, who'd been in cell block C for 8 years, walked over to where Darnell stood by the fence. "You made yourself a real problem," Reggie said in a low voice. "Hank's not just some tough guy. He's got pull in here. Guards look the other way when he wants something." "I didn't want trouble," Darnell replied, eyes still, scanning the yard. "But I won't bow to a man just because he's loud." Reggie shook his head. "Loud? No. Dangerous? Yes, he's jumped men in their cells before. Had guys beat so bad they couldn't walk for weeks. You should keep your back to a wall from now on." Darnell didn't respond. His mind drifted to a memory years ago, a cramped apartment in the Bronx, his uncle's voice teaching him not just moves, but the heart of kung fu. A fight isn't about proving you're the strongest. It's about knowing when strength is needed and when it isn't. That night, Hank's revenge started to take shape. While Darnell sat in his cell reading a worn paperback, he heard boots in the hall. 3 of Hank's men stopped outside his bars. One leaned in. "Hank says you've got guts, rookie. He wants to see how far they go. Tomorrow night, laundry room, after lights out." The man grinned, tapping the bars. "Come alone." Darnell closed his book slowly. "And if I don't, then we come here. And we won't be alone." When they left, Darnell sat back on his bunk, thinking. He knew the trap they wanted. Him cornered where no guards would intervene. But he also knew something else. The laundry room had cameras and one blind spot. If Hank was as arrogant as he thought, he'd choose that exact spot for the fight. Morning came with tension, so thick it felt like the walls were holding their breath. Hank strutted through the chow hall again, but this time he didn't approach. He just smirked from across the room. Men watched Darnell like they were waiting to see if he'd walk into his own funeral. That night, after lights out, Darnell moved through the darkened hall toward the laundry room. The air smelled faintly of detergent and damp concrete. He stepped inside, his bare feet silent on the floor. In the shadows near the blind spot, Hank stood with 4 men. "Well," Hank said, stepping forward, "you showed. Guess you're not a coward after all." "I came because you gave me no choice," Darnell said. Hank cracked his knuckles. "Oh, you had a choice. You could have kept your head down like everyone else. The first man lunged. Darnell pivoted, his arm sweeping the attacker's strike away, his palm snapping forward into the man's ribs. The man gasped and collapsed. Two more came from the sides. Darnell ducked one swing, caught the other by the wrist, and used his own momentum to flip him onto the floor. A quick kick to the stomach kept him down. Hank's last man hesitated, glancing at the two groaning. On the ground, before throwing a punch, Darnell sidestepped, striking with a precise, short jab to the jaw that dropped him. Now it was just Hank. The bully's grin had faded into something colder. "Not bad," he muttered. "But I'm not." "Them." Darnell lowered his stance. "Then let's see." Hank stepped forward with the weight of a man who had never been challenged and truly believed he couldn't lose. His massive shoulders rolling, fists clenched, eyes locked on Darnell with a mix of rage and anticipation, and in that instant, the laundry room seemed to shrink until it was just the two of them. Hank threw the first punch, a heavy, looping right meant to end the fight quickly, but Darnell slipped it like water sliding around a stone, his feet gliding into position as his open palm tapped Hank's wrist away and his other hand darted in for a quick, sharp strike to the chest. Hank staggered a step but recovered fast, swinging again. This time a backhand meant to catch Darnell off guard. Yet Darnell bent at the waist and let the blow pass inches over his head, rising smoothly, to deliver a controlled kick to Hank's thigh that made the bigger man grunt. Hank came on again, faster now, jabbing with surprising speed for his size, and one of his punches grazed Darnell's cheek, a reminder that Hank was still dangerous and still had the power to hurt him badly if he got through. Darnell circled, breathing slow, eyes scanning Hank's movements the way his uncle had taught him long ago, not just looking at the hands but at the shoulders, the hips, the shifting of weight that told the truth before a punch was thrown. Hank lunged in close, trying to use his size to grapple, but Darnell's hands flashed up, seizing Hank's forearm and twisting his body into a fluid turn that redirected Hank's momentum, sending the bigger man crashing into one of the laundry carts with a loud bang. Hank roared in anger, scrambling up and charged again, but this time Darnell met him head-on, sidestepping at the last moment and striking with the heel of his palm under Hank's chin, snapping the bully's head back and forcing him to stumble. Darnell didn't follow up with a flurry or a knockout blow. Instead, he stepped back, his voice calm but carrying in the room. "I told you this was a warning. You can walk away now, or you can leave here broken." The crew, groaning and holding their injuries on the floor, stared in stunned silence. And even Hank hesitated, pride warring with the cold truth settling in his gut. He spat to the side, eyes burning, then rushed again in a last burst of fury, throwing wild blows in rapid succession. Darnell blocked high, low high again, then pivoted smoothly, catching Hank's wrist and locking it in a painful hold that dropped the bigger man to one knee with a howl. "It's over," Darnell said quietly, looking Hank in the eye. "You can keep being feared, or you can start being respected. That choice is yours." For a moment, Hank just knelt there, chest heaving, the sound of his breathing mixing with the hum of the machines. And then he wrenched his arm free, glaring, but this time there was no smug grin, no threat on his lips. He stood slowly, gave Darnell one last long look, and walked out without a word, leaving his men behind. Darnell straightened, his breathing steady, his stance relaxed again, and in that silence, the men on the floor realized something Hank already. New Cell Block C had changed tonight, and nothing would ever be the same. By the next morning, the story had already spread far beyond Cell Block C, carried in low whispers over breakfast trays, passed between men lifting weights in the yard, and even murmured among guards who pretended not to care but were quietly curious about the new inmate, who had stood toe-to-toe with Big Hank and walked away without a scratch. For years Hank's name had been a warning, his presence enough to make men step aside, but now that same name was being spoken alongside Darnell's, and the tone had changed, There was still fear in Hank, but there was something else in Darnell. Something steady and unshakable that others couldn't help but respect. Hank kept to himself that morning, sitting at his usual table but eating in silence, his crew quieter than usual, bruised and sore from the night before, throwing wary glances toward Darnell, who sat alone as always, calmly eating as though nothing had happened. It was Reggie who finally walked over and sat across from him, shaking his head with a half-smile. "You do realize you just painted a target on your back with the biggest brush possible, right?" Darnell didn't look up from his food. "Or maybe I showed that a target can fight back," Reggie chuckled. "Maybe, but in here? Respect can be more dangerous than fear." The rest of the day passed without incident, though Darnell could feel eyes on him every time he moved, and late in the afternoon, while he was in the yard, Hank approached not with his crew, not with threats, but alone, his steps slower than usual. Men nearby noticed and began watching, some pretending to lift weights or shoot hoops, all waiting to see if round two was about to happen. Hank stopped a few feet from Darnell, his big frame casting a shadow across the bench where Darnell sat. For a long moment he said nothing, his jaw working, his eyes searching Darnell's face as though trying to read him. Finally Hank spoke, his voice low but clear. "You didn't humiliate me last night. You could have, but you didn't." Darnell looked up at him kindly. "I wasn't there to humiliate you. I was there to stop you." Hank's eyes narrowed slightly, like he was measuring those words. "Most men in here, they want to take something from you, your food, your pride, your peace. You didn't take anything. That's different." The silence stretched, the two men holding each other's gaze, and then Hank gave a short nod, almost like a salute. "You've got something, Cole. I don't know what it is, but I'm not going to stand in your way anymore." He turned to leave but paused. "This place, it eats men alive. You keep doing what you're doing, you might just make it out in one piece." And with that he walked away, leaving the yard buzzing with confused whispers. Big Hank had never backed down from anyone, let alone offered them something that sounded dangerously close to respect. That night, lying in his bunk, Darnell thought about Hank's words, about the strange twist of fate that had turned an enemy into something else entirely. Maybe Hank wasn't a friend, maybe not even an ally, but he was no longer a threat, and in a place like this, that was worth more than gold. What Darnell didn't know yet was that this uneasy truce was just the beginning, and that before long, he and Hank would stand side by side against a danger far greater than either of them had faced alone. 2 weeks passed without so much as a sideways glance between Darnell and Hank, the tension that once hung thick between them replaced by a strange kind of silent acknowledgement, and though neither man spoke of it, the rest of the block could feel the shift. But in prison peace never lasted long, and the calm was broken the day a transfer truck rolled into the yard, bringing in a group of new inmates, men whose reputation arrived before they did. Among them was a figure known only as Kruger, a towering, scarred man with ice-blue eyes and a history of violence so brutal that even hardened lifers muttered his name with unease. Kruger had run with a gang on the outside that thrived on chaos, and it didn't take him more than a few hours in cell block C to start asserting himself, shoving men out of line, taking extra food, and making threats that weren't idle. By the second day, he had gathered a group of equally dangerous followers, men willing to throw themselves into any fight he started, and the block began to feel the tension rise like a slow boil. Darnell stayed out of it, watching, listening, but it was Hank who recognized the real danger first. Kruger wasn't just another bully, he was building power fast, recruiting men from other blocks, talking about owning the yard, and the few times Darnell caught Hank's eye in passing, he could see the worry behind the big man's usual mask. The breaking point came one afternoon in the yard when Kruger's crew cornered a quiet older inmate near the weight benches. shoving him around while the rest of the yard pretended not to see. Hank was leaning against the fence, jaw tight, and Darnell was sitting on a bench a few yards away when their eyes met. An unspoken understanding passing between them. This was the moment. Hank stepped forward first, his voice carrying over the noise. "Back off, Kruger." The yard went still. Kruger turned slowly, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, and looked Hank up and down. "You're the one they call Big Hank. I heard you're not top dog anymore. Heard some new guy put you on your back." His gaze slid to Darnell. "That you? Guess I'm gonna have to break both of you." The threat hung heavy in the air, and for a split second, Darnell thought about staying seated, letting Hank fight his own battle, but that wasn't who he was. He rose, moving with the same steady calm he'd shown since the day he arrived, and walked to stand beside Hank. The crowd that had gathered murmured, sensing they were about to see something rare. Two men who had once been enemies now shoulder to shoulder. Kruger's smile widened, and with a flick of his hand his crew fanned out, surrounding them. Hank leaned slightly toward Darnell and muttered under his breath, "Guess we're working together now." Darnell's eyes stayed on Kruger. "Guess so." And just like that, the yard was no longer a place for casual stares and whispered bets. It had become an arena, and every man watching knew they were about to see a fight that would decide who truly controlled. Cell Block C. Kruger made the first move, stepping forward with a sudden burst of speed for a man his size, his right hand swinging in a vicious hook meant for Hank's head. But Hank ducked low, driving his shoulder into Kruger's chest and shoving him back a step, buying just enough space for Darnell to intercept the first of Kruger's men charging in from the side. Darnell caught the attacker's wrist mid-swing, twisted sharply, and used the man's own momentum to send him flipping over onto the dirt with a heavy thud. The breath knocked clean out of him. Another came from behind, but Hank, already back on his feet, pivoted and drove a powerful back elbow into the man's jaw, dropping him instantly. Kruger snarled and lunged again, this time feinting toward Hank before snapping a kick toward Darnell. But Darnell sidestepped fluidly, his hand shooting out in a precise strike to Kruger's ribs that made the bigger man grunt in pain. A round. Then the yard erupted into chaos, Kruger's crew swarming in twos and threes. But each time one came close, they were met with the raw power of Hank's brawling fists or the lightning precision of Darnell's kung fu. Hank fought like a freight train, each punch thrown with the kind of weight that could break a man's will, while Darnell moved like water, slipping around strikes, redirecting energy, and landing pinpoint blows that left men clutching their sides, staggering, or crumpled on the ground. At one point, two of Kruger's men rushed Darnell at once. He ducked under a wild swing, spun low, and swept one man's legs out from under him while driving an open palm into the other's chest in the same smooth motion. Hank, seeing Kruger trying to circle behind Darnell, roared and charged, tackling the scarred giant to the ground, the two rolling in the dust as fists and elbows slammed into ribs and shoulders. Darnell finished with his opponents and moved in, seizing Kruger's arm and yanking him up just as Hank landed a brutal punch to his gut. Kruger gasped, his body folding, and Darnell held him there, their faces inches apart. "This is over," Darnell said, his voice low but carrying enough for everyone to hear. "You won't run this yard. Not today. Not ever." Kruger tried to pull free, but Hank's hand clamped down on his shoulder like a vice. "You come back at either of us," Hank growled, "and you'll regret it worse than you do right now." They released him, and Kruger stumbled back, clutching his ribs, eyes darting between the two men. His crew, battered and groaning on the ground, didn't move to help him. The yard was dead silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing. Then, slowly, men began to back away, murmuring, the unspoken truth passing between them. Cell Block C had a new order, and it wasn't fear of one man anymore. It was respect for two, standing side by side, who had proven they could not be broken. In the days that followed, the prison felt different, the air lighter in ways that only those who had lived under constant tension could truly understand. And while no one dared say it outright, the balance of power in Cell Block C had shifted. Completely. Men who once walked with their eyes down now carried themselves a little taller. Small fights over food or seats in the yard seemed to vanish overnight, and even the guards noticed the unusual calm, though they chalked it up to luck. Hank and Darnell didn't suddenly become friends who shared stories or sat together at meals. They were too different, too wary for that. But there was a mutual understanding, a bond forged not through choice, but through the shared heat of battle, and in that bond was something stronger than either man expected: respect. One afternoon, as they stood on opposite ends of the yard, Hank caught Darnell's eye and gave a single nod. Not the kind that demanded anything, but the kind that said, "We're good," and Darnell returned it, knowing that in this place, such a gesture meant more than 100 spoken promises. Word of the fight with Kruger traveled far beyond the block, reaching inmates who had never laid eyes on Darnell or Hank, and with it came a new kind of reputation, not of fear, but of strength used with purpose, of men who fought not to dominate, but to protect what was right. Even Kruger, now keeping to himself and nursing the last of his bruises, seemed to understand that his time as a threat was over, his power stripped away not just by fists, but by the message those fists had carried. One night, lying in his bunk, Darnell thought back to his first day, to the cold water poured over his head, the ruined tray of food, the laughter ringing in his ears, and he realized how far things had come since then, not because he had wanted to prove himself, but because when the moment came, he had stood his ground. In his mind he could almost hear his uncle's voice again, reminding him that the true strength of Kung Fu wasn't in the strikes or the blocks, but in knowing when to stand still and when to act, and in using that action to bring balance, not chaos. The thought made him smile faintly in the dark, and as the sounds of the prison settled into the usual night rhythm, distant voices, the hum of lights, the occasional clang of metal, he felt a quiet sense of peace, rare in a place built to strip men of it. Somewhere across the tier, Hank was probably thinking his own thoughts, maybe about the choices he'd made, maybe about the way respect could change a man's path. Whatever the case, Darnell knew this. They had faced the worst together and walked away standing, and because of that, the rest of their time in Cell Block C would never again be ruled by fear. Years later, long after the steel doors of Cell Block C had closed behind him for the last time, Darnell would remember those days, not for the violence, but for what they revealed about people and about himself, and when he spoke of it, rarely and only to those who needed to hear it, he would tell the story not as one about winning fights, but about standing up when standing down would have been easier, about choosing to meet fear with calm, cruelty with discipline, and anger with purpose. He would talk about how the man who once poured water over his head and ruined his meal became the same man who stood beside him against a greater threat, and how sometimes the fiercest enemies can become unexpected allies when the stakes are higher than pride. He'd say that strength without control is just chaos, but strength with control can change the entire air in a room, even in a place where walls are built to keep hope out. And when people asked if he hated Hank for what happened on that first day, Darnell would shake his head and say no, because that moment was the spark that tested everything he had been taught and proved it true. In the quiet years that followed, working with youth at a small community gym, he would pass on the lessons his uncle had given him, teaching not just the movements of Kung Fu, but the patience, restraint, and respect that gave those movements meaning. Sometimes, on nights when the gym was empty and the lights were low, he'd think of the prison yard, the circle of men, the dust rising under his feet, and Hank's voice beside him, rough but steady, as they faced down something bigger than themselves. And in those moments, Darnell understood that the walls of Cell Block C had not trapped him, they had forged him. hammered his spirit into something unbreakable, and taught him that real victory is not in defeating others, but in refusing to let the world change who you are. If you enjoyed this story and want more powerful tales of courage, transformation, and the human spirit, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Your support helps us keep bringing you stories that inspire, entertain, and stay with you long after they end.